Lonely rancher gave the native girl shelter. Next morning, fine gold flakes lined his cattle trough. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming territory as Samuel Crawford wiped the sweat from his weathered brow. Something glittered in his cattle trough, something that would change everything he thought he knew about luck, kindness, and the mysterious ways of the frontier. But 12 hours earlier, Samuel had been just another struggling rancher facing the harsh realities of 1873. The wind howled across the barren landscape of his modest ranch, carrying with it the scent of impending winter and the weight of accumulated debts. Samuel stood on his porch, counting the cattle that dotted his property like scattered stones. 42 head remained from what had once been a thriving herd of over 200. The drought had claimed most of his livestock, and the banknotes tucked inside his coat pocket served as constant reminders of his mounting financial troubles. At 47 years old, Samuel had spent the better part of 2 decades carving out a life in this unforgiving territory. His weathered hands told the story of countless hours mending fences, branding cattle, and battling the elements that seemed determined to break every man who dared to call this land home. The ranch house, built with his own calloused hands from timber hauled from the distant mountains, stood as a testament to his determination, though its paint had long since faded and several shingles hung loose from the winter storms. The nearest town, Millbrook, lay 23 miles southeast, connected to his property by a rutted dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains. Samuel made the journey twice monthly for supplies, mail, and the occasional conversation with other settlers who understood the peculiar blend of isolation and freedom that defined frontier life. His neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 8 miles north, while the Pratts maintained their homestead 15 miles to the west. In this vast expanse of rolling hills and endless sky, such distances felt both insurmountable and inconsequential. The October evening brought with it an unusual chill that seemed to seep through the walls of the ranch house. Samuel had just finished securing his remaining cattle in the eastern pasture when he noticed movement along the ridge that bordered his property. At first, he assumed it might be a deer or perhaps one of the wild horses that occasionally wandered through the territory. However, as the figure drew closer, he realized it was a person, someone walking with a measured pace of exhaustion rather than purpose. Samuel reached for the rifle that hung above his fireplace, not out of hostility but from the caution that had kept him alive in a land where strangers could bring either salvation or destruction. Through his window, he watched as the figure approached his property line, moving with obvious difficulty across the uneven terrain. The person appeared small in stature, wrapped in what looked like a combination of traditional Native American clothing and frontier wear. As the stranger drew nearer to his house, Samuel could see it was a young woman, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands around her shoulders, and her clothes bore the dust and wear of someone who had traveled far on foot. She moved with the fluid grace characteristic of the indigenous peoples who had called this land home long before settlers like Samuel arrived. Yet there was something in her posture that spoke of recent hardship. The woman stopped at the edge of his property, perhaps 50 yards from the house, and stood perfectly still for several minutes. Samuel found himself studying her face, noting the high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. She appeared to be weighing her options, calculating whether approaching this particular homestead represented safety or danger. Samuel made his decision before she did. Setting his rifle aside, he stepped onto his porch and raised one hand in what he hoped would be recognized as a peaceful greeting. The woman's head turned toward him immediately, and for a moment they regarded each other across the distance that separated them, 2 people from different worlds, united by the simple fact that they both found themselves in this remote corner of the Wyoming territory as darkness began to fall. "Evening," Samuel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You look like you could use some help." The woman remained motionless for several heartbeats before taking a tentative step forward. When she spoke, her English carried the melodic accent of someone for whom it was a second language, learned through necessity rather than formal education. "I seek shelter for the night. I can work for food." Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the pride that kept her from simply asking for charity. He had encountered others like her over the years, Native Americans displaced by the westward expansion, forced to navigate between their traditional ways of life and the rapidly changing reality of territorial settlement. Some had been hostile, viewing him as an unwelcome intruder on ancestral lands. Others had been curious, willing to engage in the careful dance of cross-cultural communication that characterized frontier life. "There's a storm coming in," Samuel observed, noting the way the wind had shifted and the dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. "You're welcome to spend the night in the barn. There's clean hay and it's warm enough." The young woman approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. As she drew closer, Samuel could see the details that the distance had obscured. Her clothing was indeed a mixture of traditional and adopted styles, buckskin leggings and moccasins paired with a cotton shirt that had clearly been obtained through trade. A beaded necklace caught the last rays of sunlight, its intricate pattern suggesting skilled craftsmanship and cultural significance. "I am Ayanna," she said when she reached the edge of his porch. "Samuel Crawford," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Have you eaten today?" Ayanna shook her head, and Samuel saw the way her eyes briefly closed, as if the admission cost her something. "Well then, we'd better fix that first. Storm or no storm, nobody should go to bed hungry if there's food to be shared." Samuel led her around to the back of the house, where a small garden provided vegetables that supplemented his diet of beef and preserved goods. The kitchen, while modest, contained the necessities for preparing a substantial meal. He set about cooking beef stew with potatoes and carrots from his garden, while Ayanna sat quietly at his small wooden table, her eyes taking in the details of his home. The ranch house interior reflected the practical sensibilities of a man living alone on the frontier. Hand-built furniture served functional purposes without unnecessary ornamentation. Books lined one-wall volumes on animal husbandry, weather patterns, and agricultural techniques, along with a few novels that provided entertainment during the long winter months. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened by countless fires that had provided warmth and light during harsh frontier winters. As Samuel prepared the meal, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Ayanna sat with the poised stillness of someone accustomed to careful observation, her dark eyes missing nothing as they catalogued the contents of his home. There was intelligence in her gaze, along with a wariness that spoke of recent difficulties. "You've traveled far," Samuel observed as he stirred the stew. 3 days walking," Ayanna confirmed. "My people moved south for winter hunting. I chose different path." The simple statement carried implications that Samuel chose not to probe. Family disagreements, romantic troubles, conflicts over changing ways of life, any number of circumstances might drive a young woman to leave her people and strike out on her own. In frontier society, personal history was often considered private unless freely shared. "This is good country for starting over," Samuel offered diplomatically. Ayanna nodded slowly. "You live alone here?" "For the past 8 years. Had a partner when I first came out here, but he decided Montana was more to his liking." The stew finished cooking as full darkness settled over the ranch. Samuel served generous portions to both of them, along with bread he had baked 2 days earlier. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds coming from the wind outside and the occasional settling of the house's wooden frame. After the meal, Samuel showed Ayanna to the barn, which was indeed warm and dry. He provided her with additional blankets and pointed out where she could find water if needed during the night. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived as they finished these arrangements, bringing with it heavy rain and gusting winds that rattled the barn doors. "Should pass by morning," Samuel said, raising his voice to be heard over the weather. "You're welcome to stay until it clears." "Thank you," Ayanna replied simply. Samuel returned to his house as the storm intensified, settling into his evening routine of reading and preparing for the next day's work. However, he found it difficult to concentrate on the agricultural journal he had been studying. His thoughts kept returning to the young woman in his barn and the circumstances that had brought her to his remote property. The storm raged throughout the night, with rain drumming against the windows and wind howling around the corners of the house. Samuel slept fitfully, partly due to the weather and partly due to his awareness of his guest's presence. Not from any sense of danger, but from the simple human recognition that his solitary routine had been altered by the arrival of another person. Dawn broke clear and cold, with the storm having passed eastward during the early morning hours. Samuel dressed and stepped outside to assess any damage the weather might have caused. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed by the night's rain, and the morning sun painted the landscape in golden hues that made even his struggling ranch appear prosperous. It was then that he noticed something unusual glittering in his cattle trough. Samuel approached the wooden trough slowly, unsure of what he was seeing. The water, normally clear despite the mineral content common to well water in the territory, now contained what appeared to be tiny flakes of metal suspended throughout. As he knelt beside the trough for a closer look, his breath caught in his throat. Gold. Unmistakable flakes of gold floated in the water, some as small as pinheads, others the size of wheat grains. Samuel had seen enough gold during a brief stint in the California mines 15 years earlier to recognize the genuine article. But how had it gotten into his cattle trough? The trough itself was constructed from planks of pine, assembled with iron fittings and sealed with pitch to prevent leaking. Samuel had built it himself 3 years earlier, using timber from trees that grew on his own property. The water came from his well, which he had dug to a depth of 37 feet before striking a reliable source. In all the time he had operated the ranch, nothing like this had ever appeared in the trough. Samuel carefully collected several of the larger flakes, examining them in the morning sunlight. They possessed the characteristic weight and color of genuine gold, along with the soft malleability that distinguished the precious metal from fool's gold or other minerals that might be mistaken for it. A sound from the barn reminded him of Ayanna's presence. Samuel pocketed the gold flakes and walked toward the barn, his mind racing with questions about the connection between his guest's arrival and this extraordinary discovery. He found Ayanna already awake, folding the blankets he had provided and preparing to continue her journey. In the morning light, she appeared younger than she had the previous evening, her features carrying the fresh beauty of youth despite the hardship she had obviously endured. "Morning," Samuel said. "Sleep well despite the storm?" "Yes, thank you. The barn is warm and dry. No need to rush off. I was about to make breakfast and there's plenty for two." Ayanna hesitated, clearly torn between her desire to continue traveling and her appreciation for Samuel's hospitality. "I have imposed enough on your kindness," she said finally. "Nonsense. Besides, I could use the company. Gets pretty quiet out here." They walked together toward the house, passing the cattle trough on the way. Samuel watched Ayanna carefully, looking for any reaction to the unusual contents of the water container. She glanced at it briefly but showed no signs of surprise or recognition. Inside the house, Samuel prepared a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and coffee, while Ayanna sat at the table much as she had the previous evening. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows revealed details about her appearance that had been hidden in the lamplight. Her clothing, while showing signs of travel, was well made and decorated with intricate beadwork that demonstrated considerable skill. The necklace she wore contained stones that Samuel didn't recognize, along with what appeared to be small pieces of metal worked into decorative patterns. "That's beautiful craftsmanship," Samuel commented, nodding toward her necklace. Ayana's hand moved instinctively to the jewelry. My grandmother made it. She taught me the old ways of working with stone and metal. Metal? Samuel asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Silver, mostly. Sometimes gold, when it could be found. Samuel served the breakfast and sat down across from her, his mind working to process this new information. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore Ayana's arrival during the storm, her knowledge of metalworking, and the mysterious appearance of gold in his cattle trough. Ayana, he said carefully, I need to ask you something. Did you do anything unusual last night, after I left you in the barn? She looked up from her plate, her dark eyes meeting his directly. What do you mean? Well, this morning I found something strange in my cattle trough. Gold flakes. Never seen anything like it before. Ayana set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to her years. My people have old stories about gratitude and the spirits that watch over those who show kindness to strangers. Stories? When the earth spirits are pleased by acts of generosity, they sometimes leave gifts, small tokens of their approval. Samuel studied her face, looking for signs of deception or jest. He found neither. Ayana appeared to be speaking with complete sincerity about something she obviously considered factual rather than metaphorical. You're saying the gold appeared because I helped you. I am saying that kindness often returns to those who offer it freely. The conversation continued as they finished breakfast, with Ayana sharing fragments of her people's spiritual beliefs and Samuel trying to reconcile her explanations with his more pragmatic worldview. Regardless of the supernatural implications, the gold in his cattle trough was undeniably real and potentially valuable enough to solve his immediate financial problems. After breakfast, they walked together to examine the trough more closely. In daylight, the gold flakes were even more apparent, creating a shimmering effect as they moved with the water's gentle current. Samuel estimated there might be enough gold to pay off his most pressing debts, with possibly some left over for ranch improvements. Will you stay another day? Samuel asked as they stood beside the trough. Ayana shook her head. I must continue my journey, but I thank you for your kindness. Where will you go? South, toward the railroad towns. There are opportunities there for those willing to work. Samuel nodded, understanding the practical realities that drove such decisions. The railroad had brought changes to the territory, creating new communities and economic opportunities while simultaneously disrupting traditional ways of life. If you ever find yourself back this way, you're always welcome here, Samuel said. I will remember. Ayana gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave. As she walked away from the ranch, Samuel watched from his porch until she disappeared beyond the eastern ridge. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, promising a clear day for the work that awaited him. Samuel spent the remainder of the morning carefully collecting the gold from his cattle trough, using a fine mesh strainer to separate the flakes from the water. The final tally exceeded his initial estimates, nearly 2 ounces of gold. Enough to cover his immediate debts and provide a modest buffer against future difficulties. Over the following days, Samuel found himself checking the cattle trough regularly, hoping for additional deposits of the precious metal. However, the water remained clear and ordinary, containing nothing more valuable than the minerals naturally present in well water. Whatever had caused the gold to appear seemed to have been a singular occurrence, tied somehow to Ayana's presence on his property. 3 weeks later, Samuel made his regular journey to Millbrook to purchase supplies and conduct business. The gold flakes, when presented to the town's assayer, proved to be of exceptional purity and yielded enough money to pay off his outstanding debts with the bank. The relief he felt walking out of the bank building, free from the weight of financial obligation, seemed almost as miraculous as the circumstances that had made it possible. Samuel never saw Ayana again, though he made discreet inquiries during his trips to town. No one reported encounters with a young Native American woman matching her description. and the railroad towns to the south were too distant for casual investigation. She had passed through his life like the storm that had brought her to his door suddenly, dramatically, and with lasting consequences. As winter approached, Samuel found himself with sufficient resources to purchase additional cattle and make necessary repairs to his property. The ranch began to show signs of renewed prosperity, and neighbors who had written him off as another failed homesteader started viewing him with renewed respect. Samuel never told anyone about the gold's mysterious appearance, preferring to let people assume he had made a lucky strike while drilling a new well. The cattle trough continued to function normally, providing water for his growing herd without any supernatural additions. However, Samuel never looked at it without remembering the morning he had discovered those glittering flakes and the young woman, whose arrival had preceded their appearance. Whether the gold had been a gift from earth spirits, as Ayanna had suggested, or the result of some natural phenomenon he didn't understand, Samuel remained convinced that kindness shown to a stranger had somehow returned to him multiplied. Years passed, and Samuel's ranch flourished beyond his wildest dreams. The initial gold had provided the foundation, but his renewed confidence and improved circumstances attracted opportunities he had never imagined possible. Neighboring ranchers sought his advice on cattle breeding and land management. The bank that had once threatened foreclosure now courted his business, offering favorable terms for expansion loans. Samuel married Margaret, a schoolteacher from Millbrook who brought intelligence and warmth to his previously solitary existence. Their 3 children grew up hearing stories of the frontier, though Samuel never mentioned the mysterious appearance of gold or the young woman who had preceded it. Some stories, he believed, were too sacred to share casually. The cattle trough remained in its original location, serving successive generations of livestock without ever again producing precious metal. Samuel replaced the wooden planks twice over the years, yet each time he worked on the structure, he found himself remembering that extraordinary morning when sunlight had revealed flakes of gold floating in ordinary well water. Margaret noticed her husband's occasional contemplative moments beside the trough, but respected his privacy. She understood that frontier life created experiences that defied easy explanation, and she had learned to appreciate the depths of character that such experiences could forge in a person. As Samuel aged, his hair turning silver and his hands bearing the accumulated scars of decades spent working with livestock and machinery, he often reflected on the lessons that night had taught him. The gold had been valuable, certainly, but the true treasure had been the reminder that kindness offered without expectation of reward possessed a power that transcended ordinary understanding. The story of Samuel's remarkable recovery from near bankruptcy became part of local folklore, though he always attributed his success to hard work and favorable weather conditions. Only he knew the full truth about the storm that had brought Ayanna to his door and the golden dawn that had followed her departure. In his final years, Samuel would sometimes stand by the old cattle trough on clear mornings, watching his grandchildren play in the yard that had once seemed destined for abandonment. The ranch stretched across acres that now supported hundreds of cattle, and the house had been expanded multiple times to accommodate his growing family. Yet despite all the prosperity that had followed, Samuel's most treasured memory remained that single night, when a stranger had sought shelter and left behind a mystery that had enriched his life in ways that extended far beyond mere financial gain. The golden flakes had been real enough to transform his circumstances, but the deeper gift had been the understanding that genuine human connection could create its own form of magic, turning ordinary encounters into experiences that resonated with meaning long after the immediate circumstances had passed into memory.